Welcome to our special, in honor of Austin Powers yesterday, our special mini main stage. Good, okay, you got the reference. Those of you that haven't seen Austin Powers, and my impression was poor, so the guys can edit that out of the video later. Thank you. We made it. Thanks to everyone who's helped this week to make it. I promised I would do this. An awesome week. Thank you. I promised I'd say it at least once. So look, before we wrap things up, there's a topic that's emerged during the course of the week that I think there's a real consensus that it's going to be a critical area of focus for the next 12 months. So I think it's something we're going to come back to in a lot more detail at Identiverse next year. And so this final panel is going to set up that longer conversation for us. We'll have a little bit of fun with it as well, but I think it's a really serious and important topic. So just because, you can never wear enough hats, I'm going to join this panel, but my friend and colleague, Allan Foster, is going to come up with a couple of other guests, and we're going to talk about the future of authorization. Allan Foster.
Thank you, Andy. So in the spirit of mini-me, here I am. So yes, I want to bring my guests up on stage. I'll grab this side since you've grabbed that side.
Yep.
Come on round.
No tripping?
Ooh?
No tripping?
No tripping. No tripping. I see not everybody had a 7 a.m. flight this morning. There was watching people slowly leave, but we still have, thank you very much for everybody who stayed around for sort of the final bitter end of where we're going. And as Andy said, when we originally started talking about this, we were sort of saying, oh, well, let's talk about authorization. And then I watched Andre's talk, and he kind of took our talk. And then I watched Alex's talk. He kind of took our talk. And then I watched Ken's talk. He kind of took our talk. So all of a sudden, over the week, it appears that, and this always happens at an Identiverse, right? We come out of these things with some trends that seem to be where we're talking. And the authorization seems to have become a pretty sort of at the forefront of everything that we've been talking about. And so we've got a couple of questions to go into. So I'm going to just set up a little bit of context, introduce our panel first of all. Why don't you start first and introduce who you are and where you're from?
Galina Livit. I am Identity and Access Management Technical Expert for Ford Motor Company. I lead Access Management and Authorization Program. Kind of been there for 20 years, grew up on the job, and Identity and Access Management is my life.
I'm David Brossard. I'm with Axiomatics. I'm the CTO. I'm also, and do not make fun of me, I used to be the editor for the Zachbol standard.
Hang on.
David? Yes?
Stage exit that way.
Oh, goodbye. Much like Samuel is not dead, Zachbol is.
There we go.
That's me.
Hi, I'm Andi.
Hi, Andy.
See, this is good. So I'm actually on this panel because I do have a little bit of a background in authorization. I did some work with David way back at Axiomatics for a brief time with Zachbol, and I was on the UMA working group for a little bit. As I said to Allan at the beginning, my technical knowledge is shallow but moderately broad, and I apologize. I may just fall asleep in the middle of the panel. This is not a reflection on the panel or on you. It's just been a long week. So if I don't contribute much beyond what I've just said, don't worry about that. Allan.
Well, thank you, Andy.
You're very welcome.
So to set up a little bit of context, obviously Ford Motor Company has some access control and authorization challenges. And so just to sort of set up where some of the challenges we're going into, Galina, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of challenges you guys face and what you want us to do to fix it?
So I think about 20 years ago, when XACML as a standard started to emerge, right? The premise was that let's take authorization logic out of the application so we have visibility into what that logic really means. And so there's a number of benefits. One is authorization becomes one of the development frameworks. So if you're building applications in-house, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's something that is easily applicable. So time to market, right? But the real premise is really the compliance and being able to understand what those policies are. And I think the idea is still viable. So in my world, we have a large number of applications, right? And those that are homegrown do use the externalized authorization management concept, right? And there is a pretty robust offering in the market that allows you to do that. But what about those that cannot externalize for whatever reason, right? Either they're legacy and they already built something and it's very expensive to extract it and then replace it with something external, or they unwilling to because they feel that authorization logic is really simple and, you know, a couple of tables, if else, and I'm done. Or, you know, so the large population of those excuses is mostly around, well, I am a platform, you know, so basically cuts, right? So we're integrating, and every platform, every system, every partner we're integrating with will come with their own embedded authorization technique. So how do you provide the policy visibility into all those siloed applications, right, or platforms? Because, well, first of all, besides the development, there is a number of actors that need to look at your policies, right? Your internal controls, your you know, auditors. So the visibility has to be there. What happens when you need to roll out a new law, right? And you need to apply it across the enterprise. So expensive to implement it in each and every application, but so much more expensive to make sure that you are compliant. Because what happens, what I see happening, I mean, unless they're externalized, which is, you know, makes our life easier, but for those that don't, basically we put administrative controls on application owners. They have to attest that they understand the policy, they describe how they implement it, and they attest that, yep, they do it every year, whatever. So what happens when you have to do it across the enterprise? Make sure that you have to, you know, you communicate to your leadership team that, yep, we are compliant, right? That is just not possible with the state of the authorization today.
That sort of leads us to this sort of, it doesn't scale, right? And you've got to do different languages for every different one that you end up dealing with. Sort of taking on what you said, with David being, what, 20-odd years ago that we dived into XACML, and over the last 20 years, we've definitely moved forward, as Andi said, we've moved forward with authorization things, standardization. I know there's lots of work being done around that. Is that where we go? Is that the path?
Yeah, so David will have a perspective on this as well, I know. I think from my point of view, what I've seen is a lot of work at what I'd call the transport layer, right? We're quite good, even if we haven't implemented it all yet, but the specifications and the standards to share an authorization decision are reasonably well established. There's still some variability, right? So people choose to do this in different ways. There's quite a lot of, I'll call them skunkworks OAuth projects, and I've seen a few of them where it's like, yeah, I can just put an authorization statement there, it's fine, and I'll just send it. And how did you put that in there? I don't know, I just did. It's going to be fine. How will it? I don't know, it just will. But there are standards out there, right? So there's the Federation Authorization Specification that exists that, fine, I worked on it a little bit, so I kind of care about it. But directionally, I think it's pretty strong. There's the work that happened with PAR and RA and those things, which is good. So there's really good understanding, at least, and I think a good path forward for that transport layer. For me, the problem, and it comes back to what Galina was saying, is the rest of that, right? The policy bit, the maintaining bit, all of those things, we're just not where we need to be. And that's before you start talking about the stuff that Ken was talking about and that Alex was talking about. Like, okay, so we can kind of do this for people a bit. How do we do it for things? How do we do it for buildings? How do we do it for a non-person entity like a business, right? That's a hard problem, and it's a real problem, right? I mean, it's a problem that exists and is very present. You talked about you know, the audit problem. So I've run into this in large, you know, financial institutions where they're like, yeah, the business actually has to attest that this person is authorized. We don't have a good way to do that at all. So, David.
Yeah, to build on what you said, I think like even before standards, what matters is the pattern, right? And also going to Galina and talking about COTS and legacy applications, what really, really matters is getting app developers, app owners, COTS, SaaS to understand there is a really good pattern to query for authorization. And like you said, Andi, there's variations between the different standards, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much a yes-no question. And even if you don't have an authorization framework in place, you could still use RAR, rich authorization requests, which is part of OAuth. Everyone uses OAuth, so it's a good adoption path or a sneaky way or Trojan horse for authorization, I guess. To connect. And then
the idea of the authorization Trojan horse is just hilarious.
Scary.
Do you come out of that? Is that what happened?
No, never. It's a trap. It's a trap. And then the standards. Allan, you mentioned that a lot of new things have crept up in the past 20 years. Absolutely true. So in addition to adding things inside of SAML and inside of OAuth to support ZACML, Alpha was announced in 2012 here at Identiverse or Cloud Identity Summit. In Vail, I think.
2012, that sounds about right.
And
someone's going to correct us in a second. They're going to look
Yep.
it up and be
Yep.
like, no, it was Keystone, dude. But yeah, I think it was Vail.
And then, 2015, 2016, we see the advent of Open Policy Agent and the focus on infrastructure. So it's kind of cool because, like, ZACML and Alpha and Galina, what you were trying to solve is more on the business layer side of things, but there's also a need on the infrastructure side where Rego and OPA fit in really well. And since we have, a whole host of other languages, AWS and Amazon doing Cedar, I'm forgetting a bunch of standards now. But I think to Alex's point on day one, maybe what matters is that we all follow the pattern and we can build epoxy around the different languages and we bring visibility. And never mind that the policy was written in this particular specific language, as long as we have visibility, auditability, testability of those different languages.
So basically the idea, the original premise that you externalize everything, excluding the decisioning, is morphing into the idea that policy management is centralized, but the decisioning and enforcement could be implemented in whatever technique you adopt.
Yeah, and to your point about COTS not wanting to do, or Homegrown not wanting to do externalized authorization, I like to say that if they won't come to us, we'll go to them, and we'll provision whatever it needs to, whatever they need to be provisioned from policy.
Yep.
It brings up sort of this interesting thing that I believe this panel is the only one that has SAML and ZACML mentioned in the same paragraph on stage.
Simmel? People?
Ooh. But I think valid point, right? When Alex gave his presentation and we started talking, we bring up the horrible specter of AI, right? But AI does have, although I left a lot of those sessions sort of with my spine tingling and my spidey sense really running rampant. There's some valid things that we can do with that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the points that have been made this week, and I know there's been a number of other conferences where this has come up, and it's in the news, and we're all aware of it, right? There are a lot of really big, important questions about AI, and some of them are really scary. And I don't think we want to minimize that at all. However, there are, I think, also a lot of really interesting opportunities. And in this specific context, I think there's a lot that, AI, ML approaches could really help with, right? Some of the glue that you've talked about, some of the policy writing and maintenance that we've talked about a little bit, and probably other areas as well. So I think, yeah, there's some silver lining there.
Yep, absolutely. It can help with, as blue sky as going from plain old English into policy. I'm not fully convinced. Is it that useful, or do people prefer to use Excel as a source of policy? Time will tell. But also policy translation, going from one language to another language. A bit more interesting. Even more interesting would be generating tests from AI, analyzing the policies. Even more interesting, looking at your total set of policies, analyzing them, understanding whether they make sense, whether there's any gaps, any conflicts.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mining the policies, promoting them to enterprise level, making sure that there's no conflicts, no gaps, no excessive controls, no restrictive controls, right? It's very difficult to discover the policies within each and every silo today. So kind of providing the visibility across the authorization domain in different pockets of the enterprise.
Yeah. And looking for gaps too, right? I mean, it's always hard in a large scale like that, looking for the thing that's missing as opposed to checking for the thing that's right. Which bit did I miss, right? Where's that?
So I think and part of the thing when we were talking about this panel was to say, looking sort of to the future. And one of the things about, at least in my mind, about authorization is that we did a bunch of interesting things around policy, 20 years ago now, maybe 15 years ago. We've worked on OAuth. But I think we're sort of at an inflection point now. I don't know what's going to be done over the next 12 months between now and the next Identiverse, but I'll guarantee that next Identiverse we're going to see a whole bunch of really interesting sessions around that. And so sort of looking at that picture, as an industry, we have an opportunity almost, it's not quite a green field, but it's almost a green field, right? That we can actually make a whole lot of changes to make this simpler. And it's been brought up several times on the panel, this issue of SaaS apps, on-prem apps, each and every single one of us who has an access management product has our own way of configuring it, with our own language to configure it, and never the twain shall meet. And I think that's, do you think we can get together and get there?
So there's an evil little part of me that's like, now I just want to make a complete liar of Allan, and I'm going to talk to the content committee, and I'm going to say, we're not going to accept any authorization talks, guys. They're all sitting over there going, okay, taking notes.
Use a code word. Use a code word.
Yeah. But yes, I mean, look, I think part of the reason that we ended up doing this panel, and for everyone, just so everyone knows, right, we thought that we'd seen this trend. And Allan jokes about, we're sitting there in the keynotes on day one, and Andre's talking about this. And there was a certain amount of, damn. But there was also a certain amount of, we spotted something. So I think, and the reason we spotted it is because there is work already going on. You've mentioned some of it, some of the new things that are emerging. There's a lot of work going on, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to make a lot of significant progress between now and next year. So what I would like to see is that by the time we get to Identiverse next year, we've got, 2 or 3 people standing up on the main stage going, look, we solved it, or at least significantly solved it. Here's how we solved it. Here's how it's basically, we need to have the passkeys moment for authorization. And hey, I did a sound bite. Look at that. We were going to write the abstract for this originally. We were going to start it with authentication is dead. Only because, and I mean that in the nicest possible sense, massive progress there, and it's really important progress, and it's fantastic progress. And it's done. It's not done because we have to go and implement it and teach users how to use it and integrate it with legacy systems. And what legacy means is the stuff that actually runs everything. There's a lot of work to do, but the focus now needs to turn on this authorization, which is 20 years and we haven't fixed it yet. We need to get it fixed. And I think there's a real opportunity to do that.
And it's probably a lot to do with education, and then getting the pattern mature. But the pattern is already mature, so it's up to the software developers, the COTS, the SaaS, and then customers who do a lot of homegrown development to use that pattern and hop on board.
And I think it's really important for, large organizations like yours, Galina, and there's lots of others represented here, to come to the industry and say, these are great thoughts. Let me explain to you what this looks like in the real world, right? It's really easy for us to miss that step. And I think we've got some new use cases coming. I mean, we've talked here about, the enterprise driving this. Some of the work that we did early on in UMA was looking at, well, how does an individual control their policy, right? Now, I'm not sure we want to. The clock came up a minute ago, and it started at 25, and it came up a bit late, and the time just whoop. I'm like, we don't have enough time to talk about personal, access policy. But it's a thing we need to be thinking about. It has to be built into the standards and the products and all the rest of it. So.
Yeah. Really, really good point. So I totally see two camps, not incompatible, right? They need to work together. So user-driven authorization, UMA fits really nicely into that. Consent fits really nicely into that. And then enterprise-driven or compliance-driven or legal-driven authorization, which is where usually policy sits. But also, I was going to say something else, and I forgot. So, when I'm that old, it's just
it's that time of the week.
Yep.
Yeah, go on.
I think the inflection moment that we're coming up to is a lot like when we went through authentication. Oh, I don't know, 20-odd years ago, where we actually used to have real arguments about should the authentication be done in the app or should it be externalized. And that's not an argument we have anymore, right? The idea of a centralized authentication and managing authentication centrally is assumed by everybody. And I mean this with the greatest of love, even the SaaS apps. And the challenge that we as an industry have is to get authorization to that same point. And I'm not saying we have to call out to an authorization engine for every decision, but get to a point that we can think about centrally managing policy, centrally managing what people can do that works across everything that they run into. And I think this is sort of that moment that we get to try and get to it.
Yeah, I remembered. There's icing on the externalized authorization cake, which is sort of similar to having externalized authentication. Now, if you go to your Okta or your Ping or your whatever, you pretty much know who has created a session and when and for which app, right? So you have as a side effect, a central audit log of who created sessions. With authorization, you get the exact same thing. If you externalize the decision-making process to, let's call it a policy decision point, then you actually get an audit trail of who tried to do what and when, and whether they got access permitted or denied. And actually, I look at my customers, it hasn't been that exploited yet, but the audit log is super rich, and we could get AI to do real interesting stuff with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's as you say, a rich source of data there that is very useful and very valuable. It can be leveraged. I was going to say exploited, but that sounds
yeah.
wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So are you talking about externalizing decisioning still, or are you talking about externalizing view into the decisioning?
It's still, no, you still externalize the decision making, or you can still provision into the COTS that don't want to play nice. But if you provision to the COTS, you kind of lose that audit log. But if you do use that PDP, and you send authorization requests, in the traditional PEP PDP pattern, that generates an audit log behind the scenes that you can then use.
Yep.
So for reporting, for analytics, for fraud detection, everything.
I just think we need T-shirts next year that say externalize everything.
Absolutely. And I think the sort of interesting point about it as well is that policy or access control ends up getting really, really complex when we're down in the details, right? When we're down in the weeds, somebody was talking about one of the SaaS apps having like 1 million different things, I think it was SAP or something like that, 1 million different points of control that you've got to deal with for administration. Somebody who's making policy in your organization thinks in terms of one paragraph before they get distracted onto something else.
Yep.
And so how do we take this idea of somebody saying contractors shouldn't see that information and turn that into something actionable down at the nuts and bolts, down at the weeds, right?
Yeah, and that's the bit for me where I think there's something really interesting to explore in the AI/ML sort of space to help with that, right? Because at scale, it's incredibly difficult. And as Galina said, if you're in a regulated industry or if you're dealing with, global or national scale regulation or legislation, privacy, you talked about consent before, right? Those things change, and the implication of that change across, the 1,000 systems that you're operating and the 10,000 people who are actually involved in the policy decision-making process or design process, it's huge. And so if there's technology that we can leverage to help us with that in an intelligent way, I think that's useful.
I think it definitely shows us that we have more than one area to work on when it comes down to authorization, right? All of these different things are things that are going to have to be evolved over the next year. And I'm pretty excited, even if Andy's not going to accept any authorization panels next year, I'm pretty excited to see what comes out of it, because I think you don't have a choice.
It's not me, it's them.
I don't think we're going to have a choice, because there's going to be a lot of really interesting things coming out of exactly this conversation, because the reality about it is, as nice as we say that AI is, it has a dark side, right? The threats that it brings up to us are real and significant, and in fact, I don't think we're at that point of being able to patch things well enough to last a little bit longer, right? Things are now starting to break, and that's a big driver to that change.
Yeah.
Last thoughts?
I'm really excited about having this conversation. There's a lot of topics here, and you guys have done a lot more work on this over the years than I have, but I've done enough to be like, yeah, we really need to get this solved, so I'm delighted we're having it. I'm really looking forward to seeing the progress that we get to over the next 12 months. And, it's yet another of those things where somebody sits on a stage and goes, and I hope you'll all come along on this journey and help, but I hope you'll all come along this journey. Help. David.
It's fun. Authorization is fun. So join us. Join us. We can solve this.
Yeah,
Galina.
you sold that way back.
I'm in.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, that leaves us with like 30 seconds to spare before I have to give back to you to do the tap dancing thing that you do.
We don't get to do
But hopefully, if nothing else, we've started you guys at least thinking of some of the things that you would either like to see or the things that are going to start coming out of it over this next year, because I think that authorization is going to be, hopefully it's going to radically accelerate in how things happen, much the same way that authentication did 10 years ago, right, and getting us into that point. And so and maybe next year we wear our Zachmal t-shirts.
Oh, there's a thought.
I will get you one.
There's a thought. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I head off. You guys head off gently that way. Don't go away. We're going to run a little video here, and then I'm going to be back in a couple of minutes just to wrap things up. So thanks again to the panel. Enjoy the next little film.
Please let the dice stay hot. Let me shoot a 7 with every shot. Viva Las Vegas! Viva Las Vegas! Viva Las Vegas! Viva Las Vegas! Viva! Viva!
So we always like to finish by summarizing, some of the key things that have happened during the week. And I figure that by now you've all had enough of hearing me. And I'm also prone to getting a little emotional at this point. So to preserve everybody's sanity, we're going to do things a little bit differently this year. I'm going to ask a small number of this year's content committee to come up on the stage, which I hope is now going to happen. Now going to happen. There we go. And I'm going to try and not crash into the chairs. And I'm going to hand this mic over, and I'm going to ask each one of them to share just a thought that they have coming out of this week. Go.
Okay.
I'm going to move this.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So my thought was a surprisingly IIW-like feel, and encapsulating both the signals the side of what we do, where apparently the word is decentralize everything, and now the decisioning side of everything we do, where apparently it is externalize everything. So this is going to be fun next year.
Well, I only have a moment here. Thanks, Andy. So I'm going to start off with, Andre terrified me on Tuesday with his session. I wondered what he was doing when he sat down and then his talk started. And to see what that truly was, frankly, is terrifying. So we have a lot of work to do in that space. And lastly, passkeys are inevitable.
I know that Eve's thought is fresh because she made it up about 90 seconds ago. I was sitting next to her. This year must have been the year of the wallet. I reckon that a wallet without an acceptance scheme is like a bucket of empty promises. And we'll hear more about networks next year.
So I'm going to talk about one session, which is our newcomer session. So this is the first time we did this session before, and we were hoping for 30 people. Not only did we have sitting room only, we had standing room only. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
My thought is that it's been amazing to see all the collaboration that's been happening, all the conversations in the hallways. Identiverse is, I think Pam used the term Aaron used the term collective tissue. Like, we need that collective tissue to solve some really, really challenging problems. And the conversations happening here are going to go a long way to bridging the gap that this year's conference actually highlighted, the gap between the folks who are trying to build standards and the technologies, and to a certain extent, the people who are actually trying to implement and deploy these, and they need to be talking more, and hopefully Identiverse can help facilitate that conversation going forward.
This week you heard many wondrous things, and some of us think it might just as well go ahead and change the industry as we know it. But a lot of them will turn out to be wishful thinking from some vendor that is trying to sell you something and will fizzle. And you know what's the difference between those two outcomes? It's what you will do once you go back home. Please don't just sit on what you heard here. Try it. Try it and keep what works, reject what doesn't work, prove the skeptics wrong, or join them, but do.
And thank you. And my one thought is safe travels home. See you next year.